My name is Lillian Gomez, and I am an educator and have been an educator for about 36 years. And my background is one that started in elementary education, so I've taught elementary school, and I have taught middle school, and I've taught high school, and I've taught in higher ed. So it's really spanned the whole, K-12, K-16 spectrum. And the focus of my work has always been this whole notion of advocating for students who have had, lack of opportunity, lack of access, students of color, African American students, indigenous students, Latino students, those students whom, unless there is somebody at the table strongly advocating for their inclusion into this education process, that sometimes it doesn't reach that. So I've really paid attention to that in my career of 36 plus years of teaching. And through that time have had just enormous opportunities and success. I did grow up here in the Valley. I'm a native Valley person, grew up in Colorado. I have roots in my community back to the San Luis area, where I can look back at 7 generations of my family. So I always let people know, although I have much appreciation for individuals who have immigrated here from other countries, Mexico, South America, different areas of the world, that I do not come from a family of immigrants. I have always lived here, and I say, I didn't cross the border crossed me. Because that is specifically what happened to my family. We've always lived here. They lived here before Mexico, when this was part of Mexico still, and before the line was drawn by the U.S. government, and then pushed out Mexico and kept Colorado, Arizona, California, and Texas. So I have a long history a long historical history here in the Valley, and so was educated here at Adams State, did my undergraduate work here, and I did my master's work here, and then I pursued and began my PhD work at the University of California, Santa Barbara, in which I did not accomplish, but had a wonderful 2 years really immersing myself in what it meant to be a doctorate student. My grandfather comes from a family of ranchers in the San Luis area, and so of course he owned huge portions of property in the San Luis, which is part of the San Luis Cristo land grant, right? So he farmed. My mother comes from that ranching family where they raised sheep and they raised cattle, and they raised different kinds of livestock. They farmed as well. There was a huge farming area in San Luis where they grew, which I thought was different, they grew cauliflower. So my grandfather was a huge grower of cauliflower, and this cauliflower was shipped all over the country. This was kind of the central location. So my grandfather owned this farm, and he had many sons who helped him run the farm in San Luis. And then World War II came, and of the 5 sons that he had, 4 of them were taken and actually pushed it and drafted into World War II. So my grandfather stayed without any help, and at that time most of the men in the area had to go off to war, so my grandfather didn't have the resources in which to continue to grow his livestock, to be able to continue the farming piece, and as a result of that, a lot of the land was lost to taxes. So that's my that's the 7 generations. My family in the San Luis area held many political offices. My grandfather was one of the first superintendents of schools. It was a Catholic school in the area of San Luis, but my grandfather was the superintendent of schools. My aunts and uncles held political office in the area. So we've always come from a family of leaders, a family of leadership, of knowing that giving back to community is essential in who we are as a people. I grew up with that understanding that you are politically involved, you give back to your community, you serve your community, because that's the background that my family came from. My grandfather, my great-great-grandfather, his name was Pilar Mondragon. He and his brother Celedonio Mondragon from the Antonito area also began one of the first labor unions in the United States, and it was called Protección Mutua de Trabajadores Unidos, Sociedad Mutua de Trabajadores Unidos. It's known as the SPMDTU. And my grandfather my great-grandfather was instrumental in beginning this labor union. And this labor union was started to begin and to protect the rights of the Mexican people and the Mexican worker, and it really was a lot around water rights, because what had happened is a lot of the water was being taken away from the people. And so they started this SPMDTU, which is still today a nationally recognized labor union in this country. And so those are the roots in which I come from. My husband is still a member of the SPMDTU, and we still have all of the original documents. My mother still has them, and I have them all framed, all of the original documents and the declaration and the books and all of that. Of course, at that time, it was an organization for men only, and women participated on the periphery, of course. But my grandfather and my great-grandfather, of course, were much more open. And I knew it through my grandfather's stories, because, of course, by the time I was born, my great-grandfather, Pilar Mondragon, and his brother, Celedon Mondragon, had already passed away. But it's the interest of that says, you have to be community-centered, community-minded, community-organized. And I think I brought some of that work into the university, that passion, that importance, that vitality of interest into how do we continue to create that climate, that community, so that students can continue to prosper and grow. My family is still here. My mother is still here. And it's really important for me to continue to oversee her care, make sure that she's okay. And I have lots of siblings. I come from a family of 8. Many have left and live in the Denver area. However, many of us have chosen to stay for whatever reason. And I think it's probably because of my employment too. I had the great opportunity of working for Alamosa Public Schools as a teacher, then coming here to the university. So I had employment. My employment was here. I didn't have to leave. It would have made it difficult to leave, being that I still want to be here and want to be very involved with my mother. And so the family is what keeps me here, and my connections to that. When I went into a K-12 system at kindergarten, I was a predominantly Spanish-speaking person. I spoke very, very little English, very little English by design. My parents were adamant, my father was adamant that I would learn English at school, but that at home it was very, very important that I maintain my language and I maintain my culture. So going into kindergarten and not knowing a word of English was frightening. And so I know that I watched the teacher at every moment. If she turned her face to me, or I couldn't see the words that were coming out of her mouth or her expressions, my understanding completely in English was diminished. We were at a time that Spanish was not allowed to be spoken in K-12 schools, right? So I was told very young that if they caught me speaking Spanish at school, I would be charged 50 cents for every word of Spanish that I spoke. So it really silenced me as a young child, right? Because I very quickly did the math and said, oh my goodness, my father only earns $2 a day. A complete sentence will diminish my family's resources. I can't do that. So I remember really being silenced and continuing to learn the language. But by the time I hit 6th or 7th grade, I was a pretty fluent English speaker. Not because the school taught me the language, but because at home, my father taught me everything I needed to know in Spanish. So the beautiful Dick and Jane books that we had to read at school, right? He would read those to me, but he would translate them to me in Spanish, so I knew the content. And he would teach me everything in Spanish, which is a really good model of a bilingual program. Learn key concepts in your native language and then transfer them to the second language. And he told the teachers, don't worry about my children. I teach them at home. You just be concerned about teaching them to speak English when they get here. So I didn't miss math, and I didn't miss learning how to read, and I didn't miss history because I had it all, but I had it just in another language. When I transitioned over at 6th or 7th grade to a fluent English speaker, it was like right over the top. I started my career at Alamosa Public Schools. At that time, there was a agenda, or there was a conversation at the district level where they were getting ready to desegregate schools, because the schools in Alamosa were segregated, correct? So you had Polston that was on the east side, you had Boyd that was on the south side, and then you had some that were on the north side, and it was very, very much cut across the town demographically, where poor Latino students attended Boyd Elementary, and students with more resources, and mostly white students, then went to what is Central now, our East Campus. And then more of a mixture over at Polston. And then our students gathered together at Ortega Middle School and then the high school. But the early elementary grades were severely segregated schools by race and also by socioeconomic status. So you could walk into Boyd Elementary and see that the resources there, the payment of the teachers, the access of materials to students, was very different than if you came to Central over where East Campus is now. And so there was a lawsuit filed by the federal government who said you must desegregate schools. And so Alamosa Public Schools at that time, in conversation with the Board of Education, said, how do we approach this? If we start, can we bus kids from the north side that have never been to the south side to integrate students? Much like what was happening in communities all over the country, right, with busing students across lines and trying to integrate those students. And then having the students then from the south side come to the north side. So that seemed like a mess for the school district. So another plan was devised. And the plan that was devised was this. We would send K-1 students over to Polston. We would send 2-3 students over to Boyd, and we would send 4-5 students over to Central. And then they would gather again like they always had in middle school and high school. It was their easy solution. That way everybody moved in the community, and no one parent was unhappy with, why does my child have to go to the north side or the south side? And that was my introduction. That was my introduction to that kind of system. And so I spent the next several years at Alamosa Public Schools helping them implement that plan. Very early on, and I was working at Alamosa Public Schools, I get a call from the superintendent. He says, Lillian, we don't know what to do. And I said, what's going on? Dr. Johnston was his name. And I said, what's going on? And he said, well, we just have these newly arrived students. They look Hispanic, he said, but they aren't. He said, and they speak this very different language. And it's almost an indigenous language. He said, but they're here under the protection of the Catholic Church. They have to have access to public education. And they were our very first students that Alamosa Public Schools had that were from Guatemala. So they were the Guatemalan population that had come in. And of course, in Guatemala, Spanish was their official language, right? And then of course they spoke then their Mayan language. But most of them spoke Mayan language with very little Spanish. I mean, some of these students had never been in a public school. Some of these students, because they had lived in Guatemala where it was young, had never really worn shoes that were closed, had worn sandals, and had never really dressed and been prepared for the winter weather. And they were the very first. There was 26 students who enrolled at Alamosa Public Schools, and so there were a team of us who were assigned to kind of meeting with and supporting this newly arrived group of students from Guatemala. And so, not knowing any better, really, that the only language that we had to converse with these students was Spanish, because we didn't speak the Mayan language, right, and which was Canjoval, right, because that was the language that they spoke, was Canjoval. But the parents, and especially the fathers, had enough Spanish that we could converse with them. And some of these students have been very successful, not as many as we needed to have, but many of the young men and women graduated from Alamosa Public Schools and then went on to higher education. Brilliant, brilliant people. And welcoming And I think one of the challenges was to have them understand kind of cultural piece and how it, what its intersectionality of that was, because when some of the girls then reached the 18 and 14 and 15, well, they, in their cultural piece, they were ready to be married, right? And a lot of them were arranged marriages. Well, we had to work with the families to have them have an understanding that that was something in the United States that they couldn't do. And so we had to do this, it was this very slippery slope of how do you honor the culture in which they come from, and what do you do with then the legal piece of the United States and what that looks like. And we can't marry off our girls at 12 and 13 years old, because that's not what we do, and their appreciation and understanding from that, and yet how it impacted their cultural view and their cultural values. Most of the families worked at the mushroom farm. So, we would say, well, we would like to visit with these parents for them to come to parent-teacher conferences. And of course, if you're being paid by every, bucket of mushrooms that you are picking, it's not always your opportunity, or it's not an opportune time for you to take off in the middle of the day at 2 o'clock or 4 o'clock to go for a parent-teacher conference. And so also acclimating the school district to say we need to think differently about this with these parents. So we held parent-teacher conferences over at the mushroom farm. And we worked very closely with the directors there, and we said, look, just give them 15, 20 minutes and shift them out. And so we would take our team of teachers there for a day, and the district would support their salary and get a sub so that we could go to the parents and meet with them. And of course, they were as interested as any parent would be about their child's education. It's not that, and then of course they trusted us, but we created just a very positive relationship with the Guatemalan community. Very early on, I read this piece of literature that was just amazing to me, and it said that if you look at people who have really been successful, and I had every wish, every notion, every hope of having this success in my career, that it said that if you look at those individuals, those mostly are people who have kept ties to their culture and kept ties to their language. And I remember we had a huge opponent of bilingual education, and I looked at her background, and Linda, I think it was Chavez was her name. She was Cuban, and she had a strong cultural background. She had a strong heritage. She kept culture and kept language. And even though she didn't agree with us around bilingual education, she really was a result of being successful because she had strong ties to her language, had strong ties to her culture, and yet she was still pushing away from, we shouldn't have this thing around, bilingual education. But it even worked for Linda Chavez to have those deep ties with language and culture, right? So I started researching people. Different Latinos, different, people who speak another language other than English, and every single time those people were fluent in their language and had kept strong cultural ties. So knowing that, I knew the importance of maintaining my language and maintaining my culture if success is what I wanted at the end. And I will tell you that 9 times out of 10, when I've competed for positions, when I've competed for jobs, and that it's been equal to everybody, but what pushes me over the top is that I speak Spanish and I have a strong cultural background and heritage to who I am as a Latina. I have 2 children, Daniel and Selena, and they live in the Washington, D.C. area. Well, we tried really, really hard, my husband and I, to do the same thing of speaking Spanish at home when the children were little. And we did really, really well while the children were infants and, early into their language development, probably 4 or 5 years old. But once they went to public school and then they were immersed in the English language, it seemed to really change things at home. So we gave it our best shot. Today, my children both speak Spanish, and both of my children are very tied to and understand some of the cultural kinds of values that we have. One of extended family, one of the attention and especially with my mother, with their grandmother, and they know the cultural nuances that unless they were raised in that culture, one wouldn't know. For example, if my son or daughter would walk into an event, they immediately would search for the eldest person in the group, and that would be the first person that they would go and speak with. And they would shake their hand and they would check in with them, and then they move themselves around the group. That's just something culturally, innately that they probably do and not even realize. But yes, they grew up very close to my mother and my father. They heard Spanish all of the time. Are they as fluent as I would like for them to be? Probably not, but they certainly can. We don't have the language loss, at least with them. Anytime there is, a celebration, because their family is here, their heritage is here, they come back for the holidays. My daughter was here, over Christmas, and, we didn't have time to do the traditional posadas that we always do, right? Because, I don't know, by the time they were here, we were busy. But what they did do is that with their father, who, has a beautiful singing voice, as well as my daughter and my son-in-law, they did the serenading in our local neighborhood. So, they went and knocked on people's doors, and, that we kind of took a little gift of food and they sang outside their door, and especially some really nice viejitos that lived down the street from us, Mr. and Mrs. Gonzalez, and to them, they've known them forever, and so to try to share something with them, during the Navidad was really important, because again, you give back to your community. But the Spanish that is spoken here many times, so if I'm speaking with my mother, she and I carry our conversations all in Spanish. So I will speak with my mother completely in Spanish. But my mother, when she speaks to me, a lot of the times does the code switching, right? She'll use like 2 or 3 words in Spanish, and then she'll kind of put in a English word, and then she'll kind of finish the term, then she'll kind of finish it in Spanish. Well, the research calls that code switching, right? And that means but if you look at the language, if you look at what is spoken, like in the area of San Luis, if you just look at the language that they use, it's all grammatically correct. So they conjugated the verbs, the tenses, and so they're able to do that really, really well. What we know about that is that only very, very, very good speakers or very well-developed speakers of English and Spanish can do that. So you have to know the language well in order to be able to code switch. I can't do that. I speak to you in Spanish or I speak to you in English. I can't code switch. But the best users of language in this community can, and it's fascinating to hear that. So that's what my mother does, Now, if she sees you and she knows that you might be Hispanic and speak Spanish, she'll speak to you in Spanish and use this code switching language. But if she sees that you may not be a Spanish speaker, then she'll speak to you in English. But I'm thinking if she would see Dr. Waddell, and she probably did the code switching with him as well, because she knows that he understands Spanish, that she would do the code switching, and it's a very highly developed form of language, which in the past we had said, oh, it's Spanglish, it's a dialect, it's of lower intellect, of lower class. Oh no, it really isn't. Linguists have looked at that and said you have to be a master of both languages in order to do that. You have to know, in order to break the rules of the language, you have to know the language well. For the longest time, I have really always been what I call trying to reach this level of what I call equitymindedness, right? How do we advocate for equity, right? So how do we look at equity with race, class, gender, and sexual orientation? That has been pivotal in my thinking in my community. And so while in this tight-knit community, we still were experiencing racism, sexism, homophobia, classism, right? We said, how do we inform this tight-knit community of thoughts, of beliefs outside of this? So that was my work at the University of California, Santa Barbara, was to really look at this. And what I know now, although I have a very tight-knit community in which I go to sustain me, to rejuvenate me, to build me sometimes when I'm tired, and that's the community of San Luis, where everybody knows everybody and everybody, supports you, and no matter, this unconditional support that you get. We still needed to think about those kinds of issues. So what I started to do in my work was really look at allies in this work. That I know that we're not going to solve the issue around sexism if in fact we don't invite men into the conversation. We're not going to solve the issue of racism if we don't invite a diverse population to have the conversation. We're not going to solve the issue of homophobia if in fact we don't have people who are straight in the conversation. Those are the advocates and the allies. So I look at it as a tight-knit community, yes, but I see it beyond that. And that when we create this dialogue, it has to be among white men, white women, people of color, rich and poor. We're not going to inform classism in the way we need to inform classism if we don't invite the affluent into the conversation. And so that's really been this understanding this tight-knit community, but also understanding that we need to see beyond that. And that's been the work here at the university. The Cielo Working Group, the equity group that we do, is that we try to invite lots of perspectives into the conversation, many, many times, to inform the dialogue, to make us think, to make us change, to make us consider, to make us reconsider some notions that we might have around race, class, gender, and sexual orientation. This will always be home. This is what centers me. This is what keeps me real. Because, I love the East Coast. And I have traveled there often and spent time in Washington, D.C., New York, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, have spent a lot of time on the East Coast, and I appreciate so many things about the East Coast life, but then I need to come home and get centered. I had a wonderful opportunity in the 90s to travel and work in South Africa, and it was at the end of apartheid. It was when Nelson Mandela had become the president of South Africa, and we were invited as a contingency of U.S. educators to inform the new South African government about segregation and about issues of race. Because what happened in this country is that we bused people and we integrated schools, right? But we never really talked about the real relationship of race between white students and black students. So we put them together in schools and they separated themselves again, and they still do today. So they said to us as U.S. educators, what would you do if you had this to do all over again? And we said, keep people segregated until people really understand and can appreciate their cultural differences. Go through that, what does that look like? What does it mean to be in this diverse piece? And to really talk about acceptance, and to really talk about difference and celebration and honoring of language and culture and difference. Because if you just do it and just put people will re-segregate themselves again, because that's what happened in our schools. And probably, like I said, still today. And one of the important pieces, and always happy to come back to the Valley, I was like, this is good to come back. But if you see South Africa, it's very arid and very dry. And you would think that you were at the foot of Mount Blanca. And what I did was I worked in what they called container schools. And container schools were railroad cars that had been shipped from the United States to South Africa. And every one of the railroad cars was a classroom. But it was just a boarded up railroad car where 30 children would sit on mats on the floor. And they would be taught with very, very little resources. And maybe there were 300 children, and they were kind of in a circle, and then the children would go to their cart or their classroom, right? And then we got there, and of course were part of the classroom instruction and so forth. Then we had the opportunity of going to Robben Island, But we went to Robben Island with a man who had been in prison there for 26 years with Nelson Mandela, and who led the tour was one of the guards. But because you know that the South African government had gone through this piece of reconciliation and forgiveness of the guards in which guarded Nelson Mandela at Robben Island, because they were beginning to talk. And so the two of them, the prisoner and the guard, led the tour of the prison in South Africa and Robben Island. And it looked very much, I don't know if you've ever traveled to San Francisco, but Cape Town is very much like San Francisco, and Robben Island is very much like Alcatraz. You thought you were there. The first time I experienced very clear racism, not as much as a woman, but just as a person of color, was here at the university, my freshman year. And we were told, and I, of course, being as naive as I was, raised my hand because I, would read, it was a psychology course, and I would raise my hand and want to have input into the conversation. And I wouldn't be called on, and I wouldn't be called on, and I wouldn't be called on. And I would raise my hand and raise my hand. So I talked to the professor after class, and I said, Dr. So-and-so, I raised my hand, and you don't call on me. Why? And he said, because I don't need your radical bullshit in the middle of this class. I said, it was nothing radical that I was going to share with you. In fact, it was my insight into some of Freud's theories about how I think it impacts, and I had read the stuff, and he said, well, I don't need it in my classroom, I need it out of my classroom. So then you're militant, radical bullshit. So did I become a militant radical at this university? You bet so. You bet so, absolutely. So when you read what happened in the 70s and you happened in the early 80s, I was right smack in the middle of it, with the armband and the whole thing. And so when I graduated from college, we all wore our red armbands with a huelga flag on it. And when we graduated, we did this, and we were escorted off the platform. But I didn't come like that. But it made me that, and that's okay. Not only did we have to compete and do well, we had to do better. Not only did we have to read and write well, we had to do it better. Because any little piece that would have said that we were not up to par, we would have been gone. We had to be the cream of the crop and better. But we were, because we could compete academically, because we were really smart. But we had to work hard at it. It didn't come easy.
Can I follow up with that? It's, listening to this, you pull us into this moment in the 60s and 70s when the country is in the throes of really changing, and there's a great deal of racial and ethnic tension. It would have been just as easy for you to say, this university did a disservice to me, but you came back, and here you are, and we're interviewing you on Adams State's campus, and you've worked very hard over the last several years to continue to make it a better university. What made you want to come back to a university that your freshman year wasn't as welcoming as it could have been?
Because we couldn't leave behind students that look like us. Because it wasn't good enough for us just to make it. Because behind me came lots of other kids who looked just like me. And we had to make it better, and we need to continue to make it better, so that students of color continue to have access and opportunity in higher education. And if not us, who? And if not now, when? And would I do it all over again? Absolutely. This campus is a very different place today. It's a very different place. And, those things may continue to occur, I don't know. But with all of the work that we've done in the equity-minded training that we've done among faculty and staff, is that those kinds of things might occur, yes. But I think sometimes it's unaware bias, and it's unintentional. Not that it's not as hurtful, yes, but it's a different point of conversation that you can have with individuals when it's unaware and unintentional. When you're really struggling with it is when it's clear and direct racism, sexism. I mean, we're biased sometimes because we don't know what we don't know. But opportunities to engage people in the conversation can change those ideas, can change those notions. But I do believe we are in a better place. Have we arrived yet? No. No. There's still time and there's still many, many things that we need to do. But do I believe that it's better here for students of color? Absolutely. Especially being designated, who would ever think, as a Hispanic serving institution.